Canada was first and foremost. I think Canada was the country that suggested the United States invoke Article 5 after 9/11. They sent troops to Afghanistan. I mean, they have been a stalwart ally. The idea that we would pick a fight with our closest neighbor and a neighbor that shares so much of the law and liberty tradition of the United States is absolutely ludicrous.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report, your one-stop guide to everything Donald Trump, the administration, politics, foreign affairs. There's so much going on in this second year of the Trump administration, so we'll get all into it. And today I have got investigative journalist and editor of The Insider, Michael Weiss, on the show. Michael, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be back, Maddie.
We've got to speak up to, in the lead up of Donald Trump's arrival, he's just arrived at the World Economic Forum at Davos. He is set to speak in the next 10 or 20 minutes. So we'll see how, timely this is. But we have seen in the lead up to his arrival a lot of speeches such as Mark Carney's, the EU foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, using their speeches as an opportunity to show strength and deterrence towards Donald Trump's desire to annex Greenland. So in the face of EU leaders and NATO countries reuniting with Donald Trump today, how do you think this will go down?
Well, I mean, there's an interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal which notes that it's not just traditional liberal allies within NATO who are a little dyspeptic over Trump's threats to forcibly annex sovereign European territory, but also the populist far right don't like this policy at all. Nigel Farage of Reform in the UK, Jordan Bardella of National Rally in France, they have come out quite outspokenly and denounced this, which makes sense because once the United States starts gobbling up European territory, where is it going to stop? And what is to prevent the next president, MAGA anointed or otherwise, from deciding one day, there are really lovely strips of real estate on the French Riviera that I'd like to own, and it's all about title, and we're the United States. We can do anything with the force of power, right? I mean, I thought Carney's speech was superb. I'm not very keen on Canada's burgeoning trade and strategic relationship with China, but leave that to one side. I think his diagnosis was spot on. And, one of the things he noted, which I think is getting a little too little attention in the United States, is this process of rupture, not transition, as he put it, goes back decades. It didn't begin with Donald Trump, but Donald Trump is the most aggressive and naked expression of it. Even under Obama, the United States was sort of sunsetting its relationship with Europe, or I should say the importance of Europe as a strategic partner in favor of this, phantasmagoric pivot to Asia, which every president seems to want to do, and yet none actually achieves. But look, Trump is coming in to this forum as a global pariah, or at least as a pariah in the West. It will not have gone unnoticed by the attendees there from Western and, Central and Eastern European countries that Russia and China are absolutely rubbing their hands with glee about this Greenland takeover plan, because they see this for what it is. It is NATO cannibalizing itself. It would spell the end of NATO for the United States to go to war with Denmark, or even to, even up to this very state that we're in. This is sort of unprecedented. I mean, the United States is the primus inter pares of the alliance. Without it, Trump is not wrong to say the alliance simply does not exist, or at least it doesn't exist in its traditional form. For us to go around bullying and threatening to send the troops in to fight Europeans is extraordinary and depressing.
Well, we'll get into kind of the state of NATO and where that really leads us. I can see that Donald Trump is speaking now, but I want to stick on Canada's role in all of this. You mentioned this speech was extraordinary from Mark Carney. He's received quite a lot of praise online for his comments. So a few comments I'll read out to the audience. So a few things he said. He said, on Arctic sovereignty, we stand firmly with Greenland and Denmark and fully support their unique right to determine Greenland's future. He said Canada strongly opposes tariffs over Greenland and calls for focused talks to achieve our shared objectives of security and prosperity in the Arctic. And the main takeaway for me, Michael, was this: our commitment to NATO's Article 5 is unwavering. Now, before this speech, we saw earlier Mark Carney basically committing to NATO, blatantly saying that Canada would turn against its neighbour if the US invaded Greenland. I mean, how significant is that if there is potentially this sever of ties between the United States and Canada?
The stereotype of the ugly American, unfortunately, has some truth to it. And one of the things that I try to push back against in my country is this sort of chauvinistic notion that America does everything for everybody else, and everybody else is a bunch of freeloading sort of charity cases. Yeah. I mean, this is what Donald Trump has said about Ukraine. But the fact remains, Maddie, Article 5 was invoked once in the history of NATO. Every country came to America's defense after September 11th. America has yet to be tested in a way that it must come to the defense of another NATO member state, should that state, declare the need for collective security. Canada was first and foremost. I think Canada was the country that suggested the United States invoke Article 5 after 9/11. They sent troops to Afghanistan. I mean, they have been a stalwart ally. The idea that we would pick a fight with our closest neighbor and a neighbor that shares so much of the law and liberty tradition of the United States is absolutely ludicrous. What was also powerful in that speech that Carney delivered, he cited a fantastic essay by the Czech dissident turned president Václav Havel, The Power of the Powerless. Now, that essay, I mean, to those who've read it and know it, is about resistance in a communist totalitarian regime, right? Small acts of defiance which actually break down some of the psychological barriers that allow these regimes to be maintained. Drawing moral equivalence, the Canadian Prime Minister drawing moral equivalence between Donald Trump and the socialist regime of Czechoslovakia. Yeah. Didn't go unnoticed to those of us who kind of know our history there. And I mean, it's an extraordinary parallel, not a parallel Donald Trump will understand or appreciate. I don't think he knows who Václav Havel is, and I don't think he could quite follow the import or the substance of Carney's speech. But I mean, incredible to hear. And look, I mean, this idea that, going along to get along because the United States is a hegemon, because it has extraordinary resources of hard power, because it is essentially the world's only superpower, properly speaking, it can sort of pick and choose what it wants within the international order in terms of rules, values. Here we abide by international law, there we do not. And it is up to us as the United States to be the arbiter of what goes and what doesn't. That this is no longer saleable. This is no longer, the juice ain't worth the squeeze, as we say in the United States. And I think that diagnosis that Carney has made is very rare and unusual for a Western liberal leader to say things like this. But it's been something that Europeans have been saying for decades, for years. It's just nobody's had the courage to get up at a global forum and pronounce it in such unvarnished terms like that.
And that kind of seems to be the theme of the last few days, that, I don't know if these EU leaders have come together to say we need to show strength either in person at Davos, or that we need to be saying things online to show the unity that we've got going on in the face of what we don't know is about to happen when Trump arrives. But I want to read out this quote from the former Danish PM and Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen. He wrote an article for The Economist, and he said that during his tenure and his role, he said he considered America the leader of the free world, but following the threats to Greenland, I must now conclude that enough is enough. Europe must defend its interests. So how many European countries and countries in the West do you think in general, Michael, will be thinking that Donald Trump and the United States are no longer the leaders of the free world?
Well, a friend of mine, Elliot Cohen, who is the former counselor at the State Department for George W. Bush, brilliant guy, very traditional Republican internationalist, wrote an essay in The Atlantic, and he spent many years trying to understand what motivates the psyche of Donald Trump, and it's a combination of things, galactic narcissism, ego, pure transactional politics, and obviously this hunger for greed, I should say, for money. I mean, he just wants to enrich himself, and he has done to the tune of billions, according to a recent analysis by the New York Times. Elliot Cohen came out and said, one of the sort of through lines of Trump is that when you stand up to him and he can detect that you mean business, so there's no bluff to be called, he backs down. He wilts like a salted snail. I mean, we've seen this in sort of farcical ways. Zoran Mamdani, the mayor of New York City, where I live, a declared socialist, somebody that Donald Trump, despised and ridiculed as a communist jihadi and all that. Mamdani wins sweepingly in this past election. Trump invites him to the White House, and I've never seen Trump moon over another human being the way he did over a man who has called him a fascist, to the point of joking, "It's okay, you can call me a fascist here in the Oval Office." I mean, there's a weird kind of, psychological underlay to all of this, and I think that one of the things that Trump is doing, and unfortunately, he is not entirely wrong in his diagnosis of some of the problems that bedevil Europe and the International Alliance, or NATO, I should say, is he's basically calling the bluff. He's saying, you guys will never, ever pick a fight with me, the big bad United States, over a place like Greenland. I can do whatever I want here because you need my bases in Germany. You need, the nuclear umbrella that I provide. You need basically everything, even if I don't intend to ever enforce Article 5, the very existence of this thing with America as the guarantor of it is enough. I can, bestride the world like a colossus. And, Elliot's position is Europe should send a garrison of troops, all armed with the kinds of weapons that can make life very unpleasant for an occupying army, which the United States has been in two different theaters across the world very recently, and also sanction the United States. Anti-coercive measures. Why not put sanctions on U.S. officials in Congress who are calling for the annexation of Greenland, illegal imperialist land grabs? These kinds of things would be a shock to the system, to the United States. Right now, there's a question or a debate. Well, is Donald Trump serious? He's full of piss and vinegar, and this is just his style of negotiation, right? This is a shakedown. He's not really going to invade Greenland, we hear. He's just trying to impose the best possible solution for, that strip of territory. He wants, as you mentioned earlier, Arctic security. He wants more military installations. Things, by the way, he could get very easily with a phone call to Denmark. I mean, Denmark would actually not only consent, but cooperate in expanding the American military footprint, because that's been another sort of tried and true thing since the World War II. And as far as our Arctic security, this is a guy who says that Russia and China are not really threats to the United States. He put up a Truth Social post just the other day, some random guy saying the threat comes from within. NATO, the EU, and then there was this kind of dark allusion to the religion, quote unquote. I don't know if you meant an actual religion or just the religion of transatlanticism. Leave that to one side. Russia and China, those are the boogeymen. They're not real threats. And yet Donald Trump is saying, I need Greenland because this is a way to deter Russia and China from that neck of the woods. So, the left hand doesn't quite know what the right hand is doing. There's this sort of bundle of contradictions. But at the end of the day, the one constant is, he thinks he can get away with anything. And I think the titillation for him is watching people, particularly allies of the United States, tie themselves up in knots, trying to, not only figure out what does he really mean, as Emmanuel Macron apparently texted him, I don't know what you're doing with Greenland, but seeing how they will either oppose him or more likely not oppose him, roll over, call him daddy, flatter him, offer him incentives and douceurs of all kinds. I think that has to come to an end. And I think that, again, coming back to what Prime Minister Carney said, that is what he's putting his finger on the pulse of. We can no longer do this with the United States.
The positive of that, Michael, has really been the fact that the EU has already stepped up in terms of military defence spending, because that's exactly what we wanted out of Trump's, I guess, bullying tactics. But just getting into the state of NATO, it's been reported today that Donald Trump has ordered the removal of around 20 NATO military personnel. So Reuters are reporting that they will be removed from NATO Intelligence Fusion Centre here in the UK, the Allied Special Operation Forces Command in Brussels, the Strike Force Command in Portugal, and a few various other advisory bodies across Europe. So, I mean, does that kind of look as if that's the first indication that he is taking these first steps to withdraw the US from NATO?
I think it's his way of putting NATO on notice. As I say, I get to do what I want, and if you don't play ball, I'm going to sort of walk up this escalatory ladder to abandoning you to your fate. Now, one thing that I think is important to caveat, and Europeans often are perplexed at how complicated American law is, and that the fact that we do have this body called Congress that has oversight, and there are some things that the president can simply not do unilaterally or by the stroke of a pen. One of the things that was baked into the NDAA, the Defense Authorization Act for the next fiscal year, is exactly this sort of congressional manacles on Donald Trump, particularly with respect to withdrawing forces from NATO for an extended time period. He can do it for, I forget what it was, either a month or 90 days. But beyond that, he needs to make representations to Congress explaining the necessity for doing this, right? And the necessity for doing this can't just be, well, I want to shake down the Europeans into giving me Greenland. I mean, there's all kinds of questions swirling in the U.S. now that, the illegality of annexing sovereign European territory and what Congress might do to put a stop to that. I mean, there were similar measures in place to try and prohibit Trump from doing anything untoward with respect to Ukraine. I mean, there was money locked in as a matter of Congress and as a matter of the U.S. defense budget to provide for security assistance for Ukraine going forward, which is something Donald Trump doesn't want to do, right? I mean, everything for him is the Europeans pay, and they pay in full for weapons from the United States. They give it to Ukraine, but we don't spend a dime anymore propping up this country. So I'm not entirely sure what he will be allowed to get away with here. I would like to see a little more spine by Congress. I would certainly like to see a little more spine by the Democratic Party, which, I mean, seems to be completely checked out and utterly befuddled that they lost the last election. But now is the time. I mean, NATO and transatlanticism has been a fairly uncontroversial bipartisan issue for decades, and it should remain that way. This should never be a hot potato. Unfortunately, there is a vanguard of MAGA activists, particularly in places like the Pentagon, in the case of J.D. Vance, in the executive, who really detest Europe, or at least they detest what they think Europe has come to represent for them. Lawless, anti-free speech, weak borders, Islamic hordes descending and taking over and transforming the civilizational imprint of the continent, and all of these sort of paranoid fever dreams. I mean, this was in the National Security Strategy, a document that came out before the NDAA, and in many ways was a kind of preemptive riposte to the NDAA. The question is, will these guys win? Because there are countervailing elements or forces within this administration, particularly embodied by guys like Marco Rubio. Not my cup of tea, but, all things being equal, I prefer him in government than out of government, because there are still flickers of the old Republican internationalist in him. And, Susie Wiles, White House Chief of Staff, she's very much of this tradition as well. So this is something else to keep in mind, I think, Maddie. There's a kind of civil war raging within MAGA land about what is the future of our movement and what can we afford to get away with and what we should be prioritizing. Everyone was okay with snatching Maduro because that, if you were like a J.D. Vancer, you could make the argument that that was counter narcotics and counter migration and keeping the southern border secure. If you're Marco Rubio, that's one domino to fall in toppling socialist regimes in Latin America, which will also always culminate with the reconquest of Cuba, I suppose. So there was something for everyone there. When it comes to Europe, this is the contentious thing. But I do think it's important. Take Donald Trump, what he says, at face value. Even if he doesn't mean it, act as if he does. Because what if it does come to that? What if the 101st Airborne does start descending on Greenland? Then what? You'll be completely out of time and out of luck without having made any preparations or having any kind of preemptive response.
Just a final question, Michael. In a twisted turn of events, Stephanie Grisham, who's the former White House press secretary and senior White House official, she worked under Trump in his entire first term, and Melania Trump. She wrote a pretty scathing response on Twitter about Trump's last press conference. She wrote that the presser is bizarre, even for him. It's all the usual rambling, off-topic tales, half-truths, lies. I fixed everything. No one's ever seen anything like this stuff. But it was low energy and feels like he's mentally slipping. Congress, please wake up. Please. Hashtag Emperor has no clothes. I mean, your reaction to that, because it is bizarre to have a former staffer who worked incredibly close with him to come out and say that.
It is. And, we spent a lot of time after the last presidential election anatomizing how the media class completely not only ignored, but covered up the very clear and visible decline, cognitive decline of Joe Biden. With Trump, I think it's fair to say, has lost a step. I mean, he was never a particularly eloquent or insightful guy. He always did what he calls the weave, which is this, I think stream of consciousness is too euphemistic. It's sort of like rivulets of consciousness. Everything is disconnected. That press conference yesterday, there were several moments where I either changed the channel or left the room. I came back in and I hadn't missed a thing because there was nothing to miss. It was all sort of disjointed, kind of the furniture of his mind is completely upended. But yes, you notice that the thing that used to make him sort of a fascinating spectacle as a politician in this sort of bombastic Mussolini-esque kind of way, he's deflated now. He looks old. He looks tired. He's low energy. And the fact that he would just get up there and start going through posters of migrants or immigrants who have been expelled by ICE from Minnesota and reading their rap sheet for what, 15, 20 minutes. I mean, that's just boring. People are not interested in that. Even within his constituency, there's a real question of this. The hot button word is affordability because the economy here is not doing so great. That's what people want to talk about. They don't want to talk about sort of the optics of all of his achievements, real or imagined. But yeah, I mean, to hear former administration officials from term one say, he's cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, that should be very jarring to people, even who support him. I think they're beginning to realize that, there's not all that much there.
Michael Weiss, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Sure, anytime.